So in the previous lectures, we saw how computable measures such as Shannon entropy and even lossless compression algorithms have limitations, just as algorithmic complexity has also the limitation to be semi-computable. Yet, putting both Shannon entropy and algorithmic complexity proves to be stronger than any of them by their own. In this lecture, we will see how we can define native measures of complexity for other more sophisticated objects and strings, such as graphs, networks, and tensors. So tensors are objects in higher dimensions. We saw how algorithmic complexity is, in principle, more robust than the application of entropy in practice. This is because algorithmic complexity is invariant to object description up to some constant. But entropy requires a feature of interest, and when changing the point of view of the observer from a, for example, degree sequence to an adjacency matrix, values may diverge, just as we saw with one of the artificial graphs that we designed for that purpose. In a very popular book, Gell-Mann, a very famous physicist that won the Nobel Prize in 1969, thought that the challenge of graph complexity was fundamental in the new science of complex systems, and claimed that any reasonable measure of complexity should have both completely disconnected and completely connected graphs to have minimal complexity. Here we will not only show that we can conform with this basic requirement, but our methods based on algorithmic complexity and algorithmic probability can say and do a lot more. First, there is one obvious realization to make, that we have two extremes or lower and upper bounds for the algorithmic complexity of a graph of fixed size. On the one hand, it is not difficult to see how a fully connected or fully disconnected graph should have low algorithmic complexity, because their descriptions and the computer programs implementing them are completely trivial. In the case of a complete graph, it suffices to connect every given node to every other node. And in a fully disconnected graph, it suffices to keep everything disconnected. So in both cases, the shortest descriptions of the graphs are very simple and involve basically the number of nodes. So the algorithmic complexity of these graphs is a function of the logarithm of their number of nodes. So in this case, if we denote the set of nodes by the letter n, then the logarithm of the size of n is a good approximation of their algorithmic complexity. In contrast, in a truly algorithmic random graph, one in which the way in which the edges are connected cannot be compressed, the algorithmic complexity of the graph grows as a function of the number of edges, because the only way to specify them is one by one, given that they are connected at random. Also notice that when we talk about the complexity of a graph, what we will be doing is to estimate the complexity of the adjacency matrix of that graph. This is a robust way to do so because the adjacency matrix of a graph is an invariant of a labeled graph, and is a lossless description of the graph, meaning that from the adjacency matrix of the graph one can uniquely, fully reconstruct the graph without any loss of information. We also know that, because of the invariance theorem, describing the graph in any other way, as long as it is without loss of information, it is completely safe to take the complexity values to be the same because they will converge up to a constant. Or in other words, the complexity of any description of the graph should be about the same, according to the invariance theorem. But how do we estimate the algorithmic complexity of a two-dimensional object such as a matrix? In particular, an adjacency matrix associated to a graph? What we do is very clever, and it is a minor hack to the original Turing machine model. Instead of using a Turing machine with a one-dimensional tape, we replace the tape for a two-dimensional grid, and allow the Turing machine transition rules to also explore the up and down directions with its head. So the question of the complexity of a graph in our context, using the coding theorem method, turns out to be what is the probability that a two-dimensional Turing machine produces the adjacency matrix of a graph. Notice that this kind of Turing machine had been introduced before with other purposes by Chris Langton under the name Termite, a combination of Turing and termite, because of the way they look like an ant walking on a region. Here is an example of the rules of a two-dimensional Turing machine capable of generating a graph by producing a two-dimensional grid. You can see that the only change to the original formulation is that the tape is now a grid, and the head can move up and down. Just in the case of one-dimensional tape Turing machines, very simple squares consisting of a single cell are the most produced and therefore of lower algorithmic complexity. The chief advantage of having extended the model of the Turing machine is that because two-dimensional Turing machines are just another kind of computer program, everything in the theory still holds, including all the theorems that we have explored before, and so we can still apply the coding theorem and rely on the invariance theorem, for example. These square matrices, for example, are the reduced set of all cases of 3x3 matrices produced by all two-dimensional tape binary Turing machines with up to 4 states. Reduced means here that we are not showing all the symmetries. So the 3x3 matrix with only black cells, for example, is not shown because it's a simple transformation of the 3x3 matrix with all white cells. So this is a simplified way to see all cases in a more compact way. First thing to notice is that these patterns look like going from simplicity to randomness when sorting by frequency of production, hence conforming with the expectation of the coding theorem, and provides also evidence in favor of Occam's razor, because we can see that according to algorithmic complexity and the coding theorem, the most likely explanation is also the simplest, even if simplest here is intuitive. But for all practical purposes, our work can be considered a formal vindication of Occam's razor and Epicurus' principle of multiple explanations. So while algorithmic complexity is considered to be the formalization of Occam's razor and Epicurus' principle of multiple explanations, whether they actually conformed with our intuition for simplicity was something not known, because shortest and simplest do not necessarily mean exactly the same. The latter is something more precise, and the former something that calls to the intuition. Here in sub-figure A is one of the simplest patterns generated by most 5-state Turing machines, only after the most popular pattern, that is the all-white and all-black pattern. Sub-figure B is the most complex object generated in the same rule space. In fact, it is not the most random, because we could not generate all the objects of that size, so actually is among the lowest complexity squares for that size. Interestingly, it does look like a tree, as having some structure. On top of these figures is sub-figure with letter C, and are what we call jumpers, because, as expected, these simple matrices appear high in the output frequency distribution, even quite far away from the group of arrays that have that array size. We can of course generalize this complexity measure to any dimension by replacing the two-dimensional tape of the Turing machine by an n-dimensional tape. In 3D, I like to think in the way 3D printers work. I would call it the 3D printer complexity, and combined with the concept of logical depth, one could get an idea of a sophisticated object by the time that one would need to wait for a sophisticated 3D object to be printed by a 3D printer. One restriction is that, as we have seen before, the method cannot keep producing matrices of any arbitrary length, and so we have to also apply the BDM divide and conquer method, producing block matrices of a smaller size, for which we have estimations of their algorithmic complexity, and put together can provide an idea of the nature of the larger object. There are all sorts of technicalities when making this mapping. For example, in this case, the graph has 9 nodes, which is a multiple of 3. So the block matrix of the adjacency matrix of the graph can be partitioned in 3 square matrices of the same size. But this is not always the case. Perhaps a graph has 10 nodes, and we would then have to divide the large matrix into smaller matrices of different sizes. Or we could stick to matrices of length 3, but allow overlapping so we wouldn't have any leftovers. We call all these options that deal with the boundaries the challenge of the boundary conditions of BDM. What we do is to simply divide the graph into the largest possible number of matrices and then sum their complexity in a clever way with BDM, just as we did with BDM over strings. BDM can be generalized to any dimension, but one has always to take care of the way in which the decomposition of the original object may produce leftovers at the boundaries. However, we have proven that such errors due to uneven partitions are always under control. They converge, and they can even be corrected. One way to deal with the decomposition of n-dimensional tensors is to embed them in an n-dimensional torus, making the borders cyclic or periodic by joining the borders of the object. Depicted here are 3 examples of graph canonical adjacency matrices embedded in a 2-dimensional torus that preserves the object complexity on the surface: a complete graph, a cycle graph, and an Erdős-Renyi graph with edge density 0.5, all of size 20 nodes and free of self-loops. Avoiding borders has the desired effect of producing no residual matrices after the block decomposition with overlapping. Something that we have also numerically shown is that the complexity of any adjacency matrix of an unlabeled graph is, in practice, a good approximation of the complexity of the labeled graph, and the other way around. We have also provided evidence that our methods were able to deliver the expected numerical results, showing not only that unlabeled graphs with different adjacency matrices have about the same complexity, but also that graphs that belong to larger automorphism groups were less complex than graphs that belong to smaller automorphism groups. This is also something that could have been expected, because the number of graphs in a group is the result of the number of symmetries, algebraic symmetries, that the graph may have, and therefore the more symmetry, the more patterns one can find to compress the graph, so the lower the complexity. An automorphism group can be seen as the group of all labeled graphs structurally equivalent to some other labeling of itself. We tested this on more than 250 well-known graphs with different symmetries belonging to automorphisms with different group sizes, and we found it to be the case. Simple graphs like complete graphs are algorithmically simple and belong to large automorphism groups. Other cases, such as lattices, are algorithmic simple and have also a low automorphism count. But more complex graphs, such as Cayley graphs, are in automorphism groups with only themselves and turn out to be always algorithmic complex. Furthermore, we proved that the algorithmic complexity of an instant of an automorphism group is equal to the complexity of any other graph in the same automorphism group, because there exists an algorithm that can be implemented in a short computer program and is thus of almost fixed size that produces all them, and it suffices to number them in order to pull out a specific one. In other words, the algorithmic complexity of a labeled graph is about the same as its unlabeled version, and vice versa, not only in theory but also in practice. We tested the methods in many other ways. For example, 2 other tests involved dual and conspectral graphs. A dual is a graph whose vertices were exchanged by edges and edges were exchanged by nodes. The algorithm to convert one into another is very simple and can be implemented by a short computer program. and therefore we know that dual graphs should have about the same algorithmic complexity. On the other hand, cospectral graphs are graphs that have the same graph spectra, that is, the sorted eigenvalues from largest to smallest, and it is not trivial to find cospectral graphs. Yet, what we found in both cases is that our methods performed very well and consistently better than other algorithms to approximate algorithmic complexity, such as popular lossless compression algorithms implemented as LZW, very popular algorithm. We also tested against BZIP, another very popular compression algorithm, and of course against Shannon entropy, and we found the same results. We were, in the worst case, performing exactly as these other methods, but in most cases much better. Here in this case, we applied BDM to a set of 180 graphs, for which we found cospectrals, and indeed they turned out to be, or to have, very similar algorithmic complexity. One concern in our methods could be raised by our measure's sensitivity to changes in the computing model, and not only when exploring larger spaces following the same Turing machine model, but by changing the model in more different ways. Well, here we have the 1D versus 2D correlation of values of algorithmic complexity for the strings generated by both models, that is, using 1D Turing machines and 2D Turing machines, which in practice means that we have changed the computing model. And the rank correlation is perfect. A simple test and application of BDM is to use it to sort images, in this case space-time diagrams of elementary cellular automata. One can see that the elementary cellular automata with typically known complex behavior, such as rule 30 that looks random, come last, while complex rules such as 110 come high but not the highest. And all simple cases come first when sorting from weakest to largest BDM values. When compared to compression, we basically retrieved the same results, which is good as we performed equal or better than the best other available approach to approximate algorithmic complexity widely used. Notice also how we did this as an illustration of the way in which the BDM method works by generating the block matrix of the original elementary cellular automata, for which we have estimations of their algorithmic complexity. Then putting everything together, we can provide a value for the larger object, and even the computer program able to generate it, we have access to. The question is of course what we gain with BDM as compared to other methods when applying this to objects such as graphs. One way to see it is the following. Let's say that on this axis we have Shannon entropy, and in this other axis some other computable measure. It can be graph theoretic. What an algorithmic measure does is to tell apart cases of random nature from truly random cases, which is one of the most important features that we want to know about data or an object such as a network. A non-random network is likely generated by some mechanism, and is thus a piece in a chain of cause and effect, yet other measures will collapse all those cases into a single one, blindly assigning properties that may mislead the observer, or someone not interested in a particular property but interested about the algorithmic content and causal nature of the object. Another way to see it is with this other diagram. You may remember the typical Bernoulli distribution that plotting the entropy values of a full set of strings up to fixed size would make. What we are doing is to add an additional dimension to the back of this graph to study objects such as networks with a dimension related to algorithmic, mechanistic, or causal nature of the object. With this extra dimension, we can separate for example, Erdős-Renyi graphs that are generated pseudo-randomly from Erdős-Renyi graphs that are truly algorithmic random. That is, they cannot be generated by a computer program much shorter than the graph itself. And that is a fundamental distinction. That is the difference between a recursive graph, such as the graph that we introduced before with near maximal entropy in its degree sequence, from a graph that is algorithmic random. So it separates fake randomness, or a recursive graph that can simulate statistical randomness, from something that is actually generated by cause and effect and has a generative mechanistic program. In this diagram, we can also find another type of network, such as scale-free, that may cover a large area, but we know an element of randomness exists coming from the preferential attachment algorithm, and that such a process can be emulated or can be algorithmic random. So actually, scale-free networks can span a wide area on this surface. The same for small world networks, whose rewiring probability would determine its place in this diagram, but usually would be of low algorithmic randomness. On the other hand, there are 2 points common to both statistical randomness and algorithmic randomness in cases such as the fully disconnected and fully connected graphs that are located at each extreme of the plot and reach a maximum of entropy when the edge density is about 0.5. In the next lectures, we will see how we can exploit all these places in which a network or an object can be, and even how we can manipulate it and what does it mean to move them from one place to another.